So honored and so happy to be welcoming Kris Massaro back to the show. Yay! And basically, if you don't remember, she does arm pro bands. She does softball strong, which if you haven't visited their Facebook page or if you haven't visited them on Instagram or their website, you're totally missing out because this is strength and conditioning specific to softball, which is very unusual. This is her area of specialty. Also coming up in September, she's doing a day of softball with some other amazing instructors in Southern California. That'll be September 18th and 19th. So something to look out for on her Facebook page and on her website. And today what we want to talk about a little bit, since we are now in season, although here in New York it's freaking snowing at least once a week, so it doesn't feel like it. But basically what we want to talk about is how we can adapt our training schedules a little bit and our lifting to accommodate games and things like that, so that we don't get out of shape, in season, that we're still doing some good things for ourselves, but how we also are managing to prevent injury and how we're managing to keep things so that they're nice and loose and pliable and all that sort of stuff. So, all right, Kris, so take it away. Tell us about what are some techniques you use to help people, like when they are in season specifically.
Yeah, I typically, the way that I schedule my workouts is I'm not a huge fan on big lifts. I know that a lot of programs like to do big lifts and a lot of bulk development preseason, and then once you get into preseason, they kind of like to taper off a little bit. I'm all about programs that last, say, 4 weeks long, because it's just a good way to schedule programming, especially for somebody where this is fairly new to them. But I think that if you train all year round, where you're really consistently training so that you're benefiting yourself more for transitional properties during the game, the more beneficial you're going to make it. And I mean, let's be realistic. I mean, softball is pretty much year round these days. I mean, especially if you're living on the West Coast, we do have the opportunity where we don't really take a break. I would say most of the teams and the girls that I work with, the only break they take is probably around September. And then a lot of their teams go dark in December. But other than that, even when that happens, I still have parents who want them to continue training and do one-on-one. So I would say some of the big things that you should really make sure you're doing during season is you really need to be very aware if you have any injuries. So if anything is bothering you or doesn't feel the way that it normally should, your knees, your hips, your ankles, your arm, you really need to focus on that and make sure that you're doing something to figure out what's going on and be aware of that. It's not a norm to go into a game and constantly be in pain. And I think we as athletes, we just have that mindset to be able to be competitive and to kind of make sure that we just consistently plow through things. If you feel an injury that is nagging and it's affecting your play, you really need to pay attention to it. I would also say that don't stop doing your speed work. I think that's the number one thing that athletes stop doing during season is they stop working on speed work. And that is going to be one of your biggest assets, especially if you find that your skills are mediocre when it comes to speed. And I say skills because if your mechanics are a little iffy and you completely stop and you were in the middle of learning great mechanics, you're going to revert back to what you were doing before, and your team really needs you to be a quick runner on those bases. It just makes such a big difference. Speed makes a huge difference. It changes the entire dynamics if you're on base defensively for a team playing against you, and it makes a big difference for you out on the field. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I think I would rather pitch to an entire lineup of power hitters than I would pitch to a lineup of slappers. Like, that is like my worst nightmare, pitching to a lineup of like all fast people, because you get them to get to where you think, oh, it's a ground out, and like they beat it out and you're like, oh, damn her. Like that sort of thing I think is such it's speed on the bases as my dad used to say, speed doesn't go through slumps. You know what I mean? But also, yeah, it's a good saying. But also, to your point, I think that a lot of people just in any position will tend to say, like, in season, well, I don't need to, keep up with lessons and things like that, or I don't need to keep up with training. And the thing is, you just have to be smart about when you do it, and how you do it specifically. So I like to have my kids build up and do a ton of lessons prior to the season so that they've developed that good core of mechanics. And then be smart about, okay, do a lesson on a week where you don't have 5 games. You know what I mean? If you have 5 games, that might be overthrowing. Your pitch counts might be too high. Do a lesson like this week when there's snow on the ground and you're not going to be doing a whole lot. Like, this would be a good week for lessons, guys. But the other thing that I think was a really good point that you brought up is just about bulking, and how a lot of weight programs do involve that, even sometimes at the collegiate level. And guys, I feel like if you see that, unless you're Chris Hemsworth and you are preparing for the next Thor movie, if you see bulk in a weight training program, like, run screaming in the other direction. See, your dog agrees. So, basically, like, why as a softball player you would ever want to bulk is, like, 100% beyond me. Like, so, yeah, please, if you see the word bulk in any of your weight training, yes, go run screaming. See, dog also agrees. Chris has 2 awesome dogs. So
That's the UPS guy. I think that basically, we rely on, as a parent or as a coach, you typically rely on somebody else to take that part of training for your athletes. So you really have to.
He's like, and that's terrible. That's just terrible.
You really have to trust the person whose hands you're leaving that in, because nothing against high school coaches. There's amazing high school weight room coaches, and then there's some that are not so amazing. And unfortunately, you just, as a parent, as a coach, just be super aware of whatever program your daughter is involved in. High school, if she's going to a training facility, whatever they're doing, just make sure that you understand what they're going to be working on, and you're not overstepping boundaries. You're actually doing the right thing. And if a trainer makes you feel like you are overstepping your boundaries, that's definitely not a trainer you want your daughter to work with.
No, I think it's important to ask a lot of questions. I mean, I feel like I've had sometimes kids come in and they're like, yeah, I'm having like trainers who do a lot of stuff where they, I'm looking at how they attach bands and I'm feeling like that's done improperly and things like that. And I'm like, this is maybe not someone you should be going to. And just, I feel like it's important to question that, because a lot of people don't know. A lot of people think like a personal trainer is same as a certified strength and conditioning coach, same as, someone who has a PhD in anatomy and physiology. And there's a huge gap in the education there. You know what I mean? And like, that doesn't mean you can't have an amazing personal trainer who's like just continuing at every single weekend and all that other sort of stuff. But insofar as like credentials are concerned, that's something you can also look into, because the guy who's living in his parents' basement and doing extra personal training sessions for beer money is not going to have the same great approach as someone who's like living this like the way that you are, and this is all you do softball training, and that's just like a completely amazing thing. So a couple of things that I strongly recommend that my girls get involved in more in season as opposed to off season is, I'm a huge fan of ART, active release technique, to help with sore muscles and things like that, or massage therapy, I guess, for is similar. And I like them to do a little bit more foam rolling and a little bit more yoga type activities to help the body to recover. What are some things that you suggest that your athletes do more in season to help with that recovery, to help with that mental break that you sometimes need, especially if your team is not so good in high school, which can happen.
I think that I'm right there along lines with you. I think that any type of myofascial release is incredibly important. And even if you don't have time to foam roll, you can go to Home Depot. You can buy the pre-cut PVC pipes.
Oh,
They're,
yeah.
I think we talked about this last time. They're like maybe a foot and a half long, probably about 3/4 of an inch in width, and you can take it with you and you can put it in your softball bag, and you can basically roll yourself out. And it's just they're $2, so it's a really easy, a really cheap, and a very convenient way for every player to not have any excuses as to why they're not getting some type of mobility release in any way, shape, or form. But I would also make sure that even if you have to do it on your own, that you're doing some type of, I call it my hip routine before all of my athletes work out, regardless if it's speed work or strength work, or we're even just in the weight room that day. They always do a hip routine because your hips are tremendous sources of power and probably one of the most neglected muscle groups that any athlete takes care of. And if you realize how much your hips were involved, especially as a softball player, in your running, in your fielding, in your hitting, in your ability to drive power, in your ability for you to get first step acceleration, for you to stay low fielding a ball, to change direction and make transitions, then you would pay a lot more attention to it. So I'm telling you, they're really important. Make sure you take care of them. And dynamic stretching, to me, that's always a no-brainer. But, you know, when I watch teams prior to a game or a tournament, you know, I would say now we've at least gotten to about 50% of teams paying attention to this, which is much better than what it used to be. But we are still, as a softball community, very behind the 8 ball when it comes to proper mobility skills, proper flexibility skills, and teaching girls how to initiate that into their regular movements to prepare them for what they need to do on the field. So we're getting there, just at a snail's pace.
I completely agree with that. I think not enough people do dynamic stretching. And I think as far as the hip complex in general is concerned, you know, Courtney Hudson had gotten on here and talked about how, like, all that research they're doing down in Alabama now, insofar as pitching is concerned, is saying, like, wow, the hip complex is just so much more important than we even initially thought, you know. And so tell us, what are some of the things that you feel like we should be addressing specifically with the hip, in terms of, like, dynamic stretching or in terms of mobility and things like that?
I think that if I were a player, I would pay attention to my form. Let's say if I'm squatting, because if you look at yourself in the mirror, you can easily see all of your hip imbalances.
Oh.
So you can easily see if your dominant side, so if you're righty, if your right hip is a little bit higher than your left hip, you can easily see, because I actually have a good friend of mine who's a doctor, and I've always learned that injuries start from the bottom up. Ankles affect knees, knees affect hips, and she has also said, well, it also works the other way down too. So hips affect knees, knees affect ankles, which makes perfect sense. So if we get into paying attention to the kinetic chain and how everything affects each other, you can easily see that. I can't tell you how many times I see a girl running and I can tell her hip's tight. And I'll ask her, does your hip feel tight? She's like, oh yeah. So again, we need to, as a community, we need to address that. So if I'm a player and my hip feels tight, I need to go tell my coach I need to stretch out my hip more. Like, we just need to take more responsibility for taking care of ourselves, because if you're putting it in somebody else's hands, they can't understand exactly what you're feeling, or they may not have the knowledge to know what you should be doing. So if I were a player, I would make sure that I was going through a hip routine. I would make sure that when I was conditioning and training. So if I'm on my own and I'm an older athlete and I'm in the weight room, I would make sure that I would go through exercises that get complete triple flexion. Lunges, lateral lunges, step ups, box hops, squats. Deadlifts are a little hard to teach, but I'll go with deadlifts. They're a great exercise. Actually, single leg deadlifts for softball players are amazing.
That's my favorite. I love those.
Reverse squats. So if I see a player has a problem and it initiates in her hip, I just have her start in a seated position, and she just does the reverse motion. So she puts one leg out in front, heel pushes through that heel, and she's only pushing through a single, so it's a single leg reverse squat. So that way we can see what is her hip doing to be able to push her from the ground up. And if we see that her hip has to move around a lot just to get enough power to come out of a squat position, she's doing things like that on the field when she's fielding.
Wow.
If she's a pitcher, she's doing that when she's pitching, which means she's going to open up too soon. She's not going to be balanced when she lands, and she's going to find ways that aren't functionally correct to basically get through that. And it's the same thing with hitting. If you watch a runner and you see a girl that runs towards you, and I want you to watch her when she runs towards you so you can see everything, and you see this little hip wiggle going, it's typically because her hips are just so incredibly tight, she's not even initiating them when she's running.
Wow. Like, I hope that you guys all go back and hit rewind on that and then listen to it again, because I was just so completely engrossed in that, and that is just marvelous analysis, but that's analysis that you can take into your daily lives. Wow. Okay, that's amazing. And you know, like when we're looking about different things, like Kris was talking about the kinetic chain, I mean, sometimes people have pain like in their lower back, and it's really because you have a tight hamstring, or you know, similar issues. You know, not always where you feel the pain is always where the problem originates. So that's why it's really important to take care of, especially like, you know, kind of the whole body, and kind of like think about how you're going to do that, especially in season, especially now, like, because over here, like, because of rain and because of snow and because of all that other sort of stuff, you know, you're going to be backloaded, and you're going to have some weeks where you have 5 or 6 games, you know, and that in collegiate level, you're used to that, but at a varsity level, that, you know, more than 3 games a week is like, especially if that's one pitcher, oh, that is a lot. That's a lot. So
that's absolutely a lot.
So
all the more reason to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and your injuries and your mobility and your rolling out. And if my daughter were a pitcher, and if my daughter were especially a catcher, and they were consistently for a catcher, a low squat position, and if my daughter were a pitcher pitching numerous games, I would make sure that she was rolling her hips out and doing exercises to work on her hip strength, just for the sake of giving her more confidence. Because a player is going to be more confident the better that they feel. And the better they feel physically, the better they feel about their skills. And those things are so intertwined with one another, we can't ignore them.
That's 100% correct. Yes. And that goes back to, we talked a lot about mindset, and if you guys listen to the interview that Rob Cruz had done for his podcast, like, we've talked a lot about just how mindset affects the physical, you know, and vice versa. Also, if you've never read Biology of Belief, super awesome read, and I recommend everybody read it. A little bit like cerebral, but you know, I'm into all that, and I definitely feel like there's enough science behind it at this point to prove like that the way you're thinking affects you physically, in so many different ways, actually. So I know you're busy, and we want to kind of wrap this up nicely, but what is one piece of advice that you want to give to our athletes as that to kind of give them that best season yet? You know what I mean? To make this like their peak season.
Yeah. Honestly, I would say if you want to have the best season yet, decide you're going to have the best season yet. I can even I can even remember when I was a young player, and I literally said to myself one season, I am going to have the best season yet. And just by putting that out there and saying it, I started taking the steps to make that happen, regardless of whether I was conscientious of that or I wasn't. But once I had made that decision, I started doing things differently. I started behaving differently. I started training differently. I started communicating with my teammates differently. I started communicating with my coach differently. And all of those things just came together in one ball and made me a better player. But it all started when I made that conscientious decision, I'm going to be better. And now we have so many things. I mean, that was 20 years ago. I'm old. So
No.
now players have so many other things available to them. Now every person has a hitting instructor. Every slapper has a slapping instructor. Regardless of your position, you can go to fielding lessons. And I didn't have those things available to me. I'm not sure if you did, but I didn't. So doing all of those things were something I was doing on my own. Had I been a softball player now, I probably would have gone to every one of my coaches and said, what do I need to do to be better? Like, tell me what I need to do and show me how I can do that.
That's wonderful.
I think that would be the main thing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I was just at the point where the instruction was starting. You know what I mean? Like, people a few years older than me, they were starting to take lessons at like 15, 16. Same idea. Like, for me, I didn't start taking lessons until I was like 16. And now someone comes to you at 16 and you're like, oh, this is like, if it's their first lesson at 16, you're like,
so
this is going to be quite a long road for you, as it were, But I remember talking to, when I interviewed Michelle Smith, she was saying, yeah, her first lesson was at 16, and it was like, wow, like that's unheard of now. But
it is, yeah.
Because I think Kris brings up an extremely important point, which is that, because you have so many resources now, it'd be very easy to kind of take it for granted and not take advantage of it. So I think if you're kind of really looking to be the best person that you want to be on that field, not just for yourself, but also for your teammates, like this is the thing that you should be taking advantage of. And oh my God, I love how you talked about how the mindset, just deciding to do it, just making a commitment to do it, is just so important. So, I mean, so you have to follow Kris on Facebook, and she also posts a lot of good drills with bands and a lot of great exercises. So remember, it's Softball Strong. One of our companies, Arm Pro Bands, and we will have that day of softball in Southern California, September 18th and 19th, which I'm sure a lot of people are looking forward to, because that is not just Kris, that's a bunch of other amazing coaches really putting together. It's just a super unique take on a camp. It's very different from like what you might expect, and allows you to specialize with certain skills and come out with something like completely different. So I love that. And we thank you so much for giving us your time and your expertise. And hopefully we will be in touch once again. Thank you so much, Kris.
Great.
Take care.
Great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Are we done?
Hold on one second.